So let me do sort of official start.
Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great honor and a great pleasure at the same time to welcome Dr. Sean Gabb, who is director of Libertarian Alliance, an organization that is based in London, to our annual, I will call it, Sean Gabb lecture, because this is already the fourth Sean Gabb lecture organized by INESS here in Bratislava. If you can recall the last lectures, they were very interesting topics were discussed, like ruling classes or how the libertarians are losing the ground on the field of culture. And I'm happy to announce that today the topic of our lecture will be using the force in promoting liberty and democracy, and Sean will tell us something on the foreign policy and war. After the presentation, we will have the Q&A session, like 30-minute one. Then we will have a few glasses of wine and talk. So now I will give the floor to Sean.
Thank you. Thank you for such a generous and flattering introduction. Now, I have been asked here this evening to talk about libertarian views of war and foreign policy. And I must say that there are very few subjects on which all libertarians are agreed. A very good friend of mine, Chris Tame, once said that there may be 2 libertarians in the world who agree on every issue, but I'm not one of them. And when it comes to matters of war and foreign policy, this is an entirely open area. If I were talking about freedom of trade, if I were talking about due process of law, if I were talking about the right of people to consume recreational drugs, I would not really expect any serious dissent from other libertarians. But of course, if I'm talking about war and foreign policy, there will inevitably be differences of opinion or differences of approach, and I do not claim for a moment that what I say this evening will be reflective of any libertarian consensus whatever. It is not even the consensus within the Libertarian Alliance. It is a purely personal view. A personal view which is shared by many libertarians, but by no means all of them. And so, with that being said, I am not giving the libertarian line on anything. I am giving the opinion of one libertarian about these matters. With that very big reservation made, I will now begin. If you are a purist libertarian, and there is at least one present in this room tonight, Mike Gogolski, whom I'm glad to see again. Mike is a very fine example of a purist libertarian. He is an anarchist. He believes that the state is, by definition, illegitimate. It is a device by which one small group of people, a ruling class, exercises power over a larger group of people. And when we talk about a ruling class, we are talking about a group of politicians, businessmen, media people, lawyers, bureaucrats, sometimes doctors, people who derive income and status from an enlarged and activist state. And so the state in itself, if you are a purist libertarian, is illegitimate. And that means that if you're asked, well, what is your opinion of war? You don't need to talk about the horrors of war. It is, by definition, illegal. It is, by definition, illegitimate. A war is an armed conflict between states, and if you do not believe that states are legitimate, you do not need to waste any time whatever in discussing war. War, as I said, is, by definition, illegitimate, and that is the end of the argument. I will not take issue with the purist, anarchic wing of libertarianism. I am very strongly inclined that way myself. I am, however, not an anarchist on pragmatic grounds. Although I do look forward to a future in which there is no state and in which all human interactions are on a voluntary basis, I do not believe that this state of affairs will come about in the foreseeable future, and therefore I do accept the existence of a state purely on pragmatic grounds. It does exist. I cannot stop it from existing. And therefore, I am not inclined simply to reject everything that a state does as, by definition, illegitimate. I do accept that there are more legitimate and less legitimate uses of state power. It is at least likely to be in the public interest if we accept that a state is here and then try to influence what a state does. And so, with that being said, what do I think of war? Now, because I do accept the existence of a state on pragmatic grounds, I must probably also accept that wars may, from time to time, be legitimate. I will say rather more later on about what I think makes a war legitimate, but because I accept the legitimacy of war in principle, or at least in pragmatic principle, if you can have such a thing, I should say that I don't like wars. Wars are evil. They may be an unavoidable evil, but they are undoubtedly evil. They result in the death of large numbers of people. They result in the enlargement of the state. They also enrich various illegitimate commercial interests. And let me give an example of how wars do enrich these commercial interests. I do not say, by the way, that wars in all cases are brought about by illegitimate commercial interests. Undeniably, however, they are often prolonged by or on behalf of those interests. And one of my favourite examples of how this happened can be seen in the Great War, which is otherwise known as the First World War. Now, by the later part of 1916, it was quite obvious that no side could win that war. The generals were, perhaps I shouldn't call the generals incompetent, perhaps it's unreasonable to expect these people to know how to win a modern war. But undeniably, it had been proved again and again by the later part of 1916 that nobody knew how to win that war. The Germans didn't know how to win it, the British didn't know how to win it, and nobody else had any better ideas. The only idea that people had of winning the war was to send a wall of young men against the enemy and to keep them rolling forward in the hope that they would break through the enemy lines and fan out behind, and a war which had settled down into trench warfare, in which millions were being killed every year, could somehow turn back into a war of mobility, and there could be a knockdown victory. But you see, nobody knew how to bring about that great push. The British had tried this in July 1916 with an enormous push on the River Somme against the Germans. And this had resulted in the first morning of the assault on the River Somme, 60,000 British soldiers were killed. It took the Times newspaper 2 weeks to publish the lists of the dead. Indeed, I am old enough to have known people who fought in that war, and I'm old enough to have known widows whose husbands died in that war. And there are some terrible stories about the Battle of the Somme. The most awful of those stories is this. In those days, deaths in the war were notified to the relatives by telegraph. And there is a story, there are many stories actually, of how a telegraph boy from the local post office came to the first house in a street and knocked on the door and handed over a telegraph, and there was an immediate sound of crying of horrified lamentation. And women came out and stood on the steps of the houses, watching as the telegraph boy worked his way up the street, sometimes passing by one house, sometimes stopping at another house. And in complete silence, the women watched as the boy worked his way from one end of the street to the other. And there are stories of women at the far end of the street who went mad with the horror of waiting to see if her son or her husband or her brother had been among the fallen in that great push. And so we are talking about one of the more disgusting wars in human history. And by the later half of 1916, as I said, it was quite obvious that nobody knew how to win this war. And so, in late 1916, the Habsburg government made a serious offer of peace negotiations. The peace negotiations will be based on no victory for any side. You simply give up on whatever objectives you've stated for winning the war, and you settle the war on the basis of the July 1914 frontiers. When this was announced, many members of the British ruling class were in favour of a negotiated peace. Indeed, the British military establishment had been increasingly worried by the course that the war had taken. Lord Kitchener, General Kitchener, the British War Minister, had deliberately limited British involvement in the war. It was not stated at the time, but is quite obvious from the way in which he conducted the British part of the war. Kitchener would hand out contracts to a small circle of traditional contractors, war contractors for materials, and since these contractors were not capable of providing the unlimited numbers of shells and bullets and guns and other war material needed, it was possible for Kitchener to keep telling the French, well, we will have a big push, it's just that we don't have enough shells, and so you do the fighting, we will stay in our trenches. Kitchener died when his ship was mysteriously sunk on a trip to Russia in 1915. Also in 1915, the British Prime Minister, Herbert Asquith, was knifed in the back, and David Lloyd George became the British Prime Minister. What Lloyd George did was he just gave up on the previous way of fighting the war, or he gave up on the previous way of feeding the war. He just gathered a group of very hungry businessmen around him, thousands of the creatures. He gave them cost-plus contracts and told them, produce unlimited numbers of shells. Don't worry about the cost, just add your profit on to the cost and we will pay it. And of course, these businessmen were extremely grateful to David Lloyd George. He became a multi-millionaire, and he remained one of the richest figures in British politics all through the 1920s and 30s. And when this proposal of peace was made in December 1916, he said, no, we don't want peace, we want victory. And instead of giving serious consideration to a peace overture from Vienna, he put a great deal of British effort into getting the Americans into the war on the British side. I won't go into all the dirty details of how the Lusitania, a supposedly civilian liner, was stuffed with munitions, and how the British authorities knew that the Germans would sink it, and how the sinking of the Lusitania was cynically used by British agents in America to raise war fever among the Americans so that eventually they came in on the British side. It is nevertheless a recorded fact that the First World War was kept going for nearly 2 years longer than it needed to be, because a group of very hungry British businessmen found it in their personal interests to keep it going. We had already had the Battle of the Somme, in which 60,000 young men had been killed. On the British side, I'm not counting the Germans, by the way, 60,000 British soldiers on the first morning of the battle killed. But after Lloyd George had turned down this offer from Vienna, we had Passchendaele in 1917, in which there were 240,000 British casualties to gain a few yards of territory which were given up a few months later when the rains started and it was necessary to rationalise the line. And so war is an evil and a disgusting thing because it kills people and because it enlarges the state and because it enlarges the wealth of an illegitimate, plutocratic minority. No problem. That being said, I'll come back to the point that I do not regard wars as in themselves illegitimate. The point is to make sure that wars are only fought for certain reasons, for certain, shall we say, rational reasons, so far as you can talk about rationality and war in the same sentence. And so how do you limit wars? How do you stop something like another great war from coming about? The idea that democratic control of the government can somehow limit the warlike propensities of the state is, I think, a dream. There is no conceivable argument that we, the people, have any control over the state. The fact that sometimes we are consulted on which group of politicians should sit in those ministry buildings taking bribes and doing favours is not the same as democratic control of the state. Democracy as we know it does not mean popular control of the government. It is simply a fig leaf by which the state legitimises itself. There was a time when states legitimised themselves on the grounds that they were doing God's work. That argument is no longer generally accepted, and so in place of that, states legitimise themselves by saying that they are there by and for the people, which is a lie, which I don't need to discuss any further. And so let me go through the possible ways in which a war might be regarded as legitimate. There are a number of conditions, and this is not a specifically libertarian argument. You'll find it in the writings of Thomas Aquinas. Before then, you'll find it in Augustine, you'll find it in Grotius, you'll find it to some extent in Aristotle, you'll find it in Islamic theologians and philosophers. You'll find it generally. This is not a specifically libertarian argument. It is, however, an argument that I accept. In order to be legitimate, a war must meet a number of conditions. First, it must be for a good end. Now, a good end I would define as defence against attack, a defensive war. A war to defend the territory of a nation state against attack by the forces of another nation state. I would say that I do not think that ideologically based reasons for war should be regarded as legitimate. The thing about allowing a war for the defence of a specific territory of a specific nation state is that at least you know when a war is likely to happen, and you know what to avoid. When you allow war for the purpose of ideological aggrandizement, if you fight a war for freedom or for democracy or to spread Christianity or to spread Islam or to spread socialism or to spread any other abstract idea.
Peace.
Yes, a war to spread peace. That's a very good one, isn't it? When you allow wars for ideological reasons, then you allow absolutely unlimited wars, because it is extremely difficult to know when the war should start, and you'd never know when the thing should end, because there is no obvious victory in these wars. And so I would say that a legitimate ground for war is the defence of a territory of a nation-state from attack. There is a complication in this, in that you can allow this and then say, but surely a preventive war is also legitimate. And the standard arguments for the legitimacy of a preventive war comes out of British and German foreign policy in the late 1930s. In 1936, Hitler broke the terms of the Treaty of Versailles by sending German forces into the Rhineland. This had been forbidden under the Treaty of Versailles, and this was a breach of the treaty. Surely, if Britain and France had taken action in 1936 to stop the Germans from doing this, there would have been no need to fight the Second World War. The Germans were by no means ready for war. Hitler did not have the support of the German ruling class. Just a little bit of sabre rattling in London and Paris could have brought the whole Nazi structure tumbling down, perhaps. Or perhaps when in March 1938 Hitler decided to march into Austria and to unify Germany and Austria into a single state. That was another breach of the various Paris peace treaties. And the Germans were plainly not ready for war, because the tanks that were used in the German triumphal procession through Vienna broke down and had to be taken for the victory parade on railway trains. And surely, if Britain and France had done something then... Oh, and when in October 1938, Hitler made his demands of Czechoslovakia for handing over the Sudetenland, surely that was a good time for Britain and France to go to war. The Czechoslovak army was large, well-equipped. Czechoslovakia, in its western frontiers, was easily defendable, and it would have been possible for Britain, France and Czechoslovakia, surely, to defeat the Germans then. No, we didn't do that. We didn't go to war when Hitler decided to annex Bohemia and Moravia in March 1939. In the end, we went to war in September 1939, ostensibly in defence of Poland, but there was no way of defending Poland, and the rest is history. So surely you can stretch this idea of defending your territory to allowing wars that will prevent the need to defend your territory at some point in the future. I will say more about this doctrine of wars of prevention later. I simply state it as a complication to the basic argument that a war may be legitimate in defence of a nation-state's territory. The second condition for a legitimate war is that there is no reasonable alternative to fighting. Obvious, I don't need to go into that. If you can prevent a particular evil by negotiation, why bother fighting? The third condition is that there must be reasonable hope of victory. I do believe that when the German government demanded of the Belgians in July 1914, we want you to allow German forces to march through Belgium in order to attack France. I do believe that the Belgian government's best answer to that was to say, yeah, okay. The Belgians had no means whatever of defeating a German invasion of Belgium. All they could do was to make sure that large parts of the Great War were fought on Belgian territory instead of French territory. It was stupid of the Belgians to resist. And so there must be reasonable hopes of victory. There's no point in fighting a war when there is no doubt that you're going to lose it. It simply adds evil to evil. The fourth condition is that there should be an avoidance of anything that could be called an atrocity. And this again raises complications. Let me give you examples of obvious war atrocities. In 1940, when the Germans invaded France and Belgium, they found it highly convenient to terrorise hundreds of thousands of French and Belgian civilians into crowding all of the roads to get away from the German advance. And this made it extremely difficult, indeed it made it impossible for the Allies to mount an effective defence of Belgium and France. Tens of thousands of French and Belgian tens of thousands of French and Belgian civilians were killed in the German attack on France. And this was not what is called collateral damage, where these people simply get in the way. They were deliberately pushed into the way as a means of enabling the German war effort. An obvious atrocity. However, I don't believe that any side in the Second World War was clean. Every side committed gross atrocities. And one of the most obvious atrocities was the British campaign of terror bombing against Germany. The British ruling class, perhaps I should say, firebombed Hamburg, destroyed it, poured thousands of tons of high explosives and incendiaries into a tightly packed city, mostly built of wood, and killed tens of thousands of civilians. This was repeated on a much larger scale in 1945 in the terror bombing of Dresden, a city which had absolutely no military significance. It was crowded with refugees, desperate to get away from the Russian advance in the east, and for several days, British and American, though mostly British planes, simply emptied thousands of tons of high explosive and incendiaries, and they may have killed 250,000 civilians. We really have no idea how many people were killed in the firebombing of Dresden, because the Germans themselves didn't know how many civilians were in the city at the time. I think the official British total is 60,000, but I think the truth is much nearer to the 250,000 that are often mentioned. Now, these were atrocities. It is not the case that German civilians in Hamburg and Dresden simply got in the way and were unfortunate collateral damage. The purpose of the bombing was to demoralise the German population so that German war production would suffer. It was, by the way, a failure. German war production only began to crumble in the last few months of the Second World War. Indeed, a German friend once told me that right up until about April 1945, it was possible to post a letter in Dresden and have it delivered the next morning in Cologne. The British campaign of terror bombing did not seriously disrupt German economic life, not until the last few weeks of the war. Actual occupation of Germany, that's what did it. And then, of course, there's the American first strike use of nuclear weapons against Japan. The American argument is that, by dropping these two atom bombs, it prevented the need for an attack on Japan, in which hundreds of thousands of American soldiers would have been killed. Okay, yes. In which case, why not simply find a nice, convenient desert island, invite Japanese representatives, let off one of these atom bombs, and say, unless you surrender within 14 days, we will consider using one of these on you. No, instead the Americans just dropped one on Hiroshima and dropped another one on Nagasaki. I don't know how many civilians were killed, but we're talking in the tens of thousands, maybe the hundreds of thousands. And I do suspect the Americans used these atom bombs simply to see what effect they would have on an occupied area, on an occupied urban area. Were these things as dangerous as some people said, or were they not dangerous at all? It was an experiment as much as a means of cutting short the Second World War. And so these were atrocities. They do not necessarily make a war illegitimate. It may be that a war is itself legitimate, but a side commits atrocities in the course of that war. As I said, it does not make those atrocities, it does not make the war itself illegitimate, but I certainly think that any ruling class that is serious about justifying its credentials to fighting a just war should make sure that the politicians and military figures responsible for those atrocities should be brought to trial and punished for their offences. And so the fourth condition is that there should be an avoidance of atrocities against civilians. The fifth condition is that we should know when the war has been won or lost. That sounds obvious, but that brings us back to the first condition, that the war must be for a good purpose. And when you're talking about the defence of a nation-state's territory, you know when the war is won and you know when the war is lost. Any war in which victory and defeat are uncertain and can be argued about for years after the event is an illegitimate war. A good example of this is Iraq. Was the American invasion of Iraq a victory or a defeat? Well, it depends what you mean by victory or defeat, but the point is, I should say that this doubt over who won the war makes the war in itself illegitimate. Okay, so those are the 5 conditions. And are there any examples of a war that can be called just? And I would say that in my lifetime there has been one example of a war which I personally, and you may disagree because you may say, Sean's an English nationalist, he would say that, wouldn't he? But I can think of one example of a war which does meet those 5 conditions. That is the war between Britain and Argentina in the early part of 1982 over the Falkland Islands. On the 2nd of April 1982, the Argentine armed forces occupied the Falkland Islands, which is a cluster of islands about 300 miles off the coast of Argentina. The Falkland Islands is a British Crown colony. It is populated by settlers who were originally from Britain. These people regarded themselves as British citizens. They did not wish to be part of Argentina. And so here you have an attack on part of a nation-state's territory. There was no reasonable chance of recovering these islands by negotiation. Much was said at the time, and much has been said since, about something called the Peruvian Peace Plan. But I really do not believe that this was likely to result in the withdrawal of the Argentine forces from the Falkland Islands and their return as British territories. And so I do not believe that it was possible to secure an Argentine withdrawal by negotiation. The third condition, can the war be won? Yes, it could be won, and in fact it was won quite easily. An avoidance of atrocities. The war was fought on a sparsely occupied clump of islands. There was almost no collateral damage. Again, many people claim that when the Royal Navy sank an Argentine warship called the General Belgrano, this was an atrocity. The British government had stated an exclusion zone around the Falkland Islands, and the General Belgrano was an elderly Argentine warship that was within that exclusion zone, but was sailing away from the exclusion zone. It was trying to get out of it. And Margaret Thatcher herself gave orders that this should be sunk. And it was sunk with the death of, I'm not sure, 300 or 900 Argentine sailors. I don't think this counts as an atrocity because these sailors were military personnel. And I listened to an interview with the Argentine admiral some years after the war in which he said, well, I'd have done the same. The sinking of the General Belgrano told the Argentine government that the British government meant business, The entire Argentine navy was withdrawn to port and put up no further resistance. And so I don't think that you can say there were any atrocities, certainly not on the British side, and I don't think on the Argentine side in the Falklands War. The fifth condition, that you should know when you have won or lost, was obviously met by the Falklands War. By the middle of June 1982, the Argentine forces on the Falkland Islands had surrendered, and that was the end of the war. And so I'm not saying that wars are good. I'm simply saying that if you accept the state as a pragmatic fact, and if you accept that states will sometimes fight wars, at least the Falklands War meets the necessary conditions for being called a just war. But you see, the Falklands War lasted for about 10 weeks. And is not very important in terms of 20th century history. If you look at virtually every other war that was fought between if you look at every war that was fought between the great powers in the 20th century, you do not see that any of those conditions was met. All of the big wars fought, but all of the wars, sorry, let me just pull myself back and state myself as clearly as possible. I do not believe that any war fought between the great powers in the 20th century can be called legitimate within the terms that I have stated. If you look at the First World War, or what in Britain is called the Great War, you will see that from beginning to end it was grossly illegitimate. No side could say that it had been attacked and that it was defending its national territory. Oh, the Serbs, they could say that they had been attacked. But the Serbian authorities, the Serbian ruling class, knew that a terrorist gang operating out of Belgrade was about to commit a terrorist act against the Habsburg government in Bosnia and Herzegovina. It would have been extremely easy for the Serbian authorities to arrest these people and to stop this attack from going ahead. The Serbian ruling class was complicit in the assassinations at Sarajevo, and so it was very difficult for the Serbian ruling class to say, our national territory has been attacked. Oh, the Belgians, yes, they were attacked, but who cares about the Belgians, to be honest? No, sorry, that is a flippant comment. The Habsburg state. Why did the Habsburg ruling class start the First World War? There was no chance that the Serbs were likely to invade Habsburg territory. No chance whatever. The war was brought about because of various pressures within the Habsburg dominions. The so far dominant German majority in the Austrian part of the empire was under threat. It was under threat demographically and demographically, economically and culturally by the Czechs. By 1914, a majority of judges in the western part of the Habsburg Empire were Czech. A growing minority of civil servants within the western part of the Habsburg Empire were Czech. The most dynamic economic areas within the Austrian part of the Habsburg Empire were the Czech lands, Bohemia and Moravia. If you were an Austrian German nationalist in 1914, you would feel under threat by the demographic rise of these Slavs. The Hungarians felt under threat, or the Hungarian ruling class and Hungarian nationalists felt under threat from their own Slav and other minorities. And they saw a short and victorious war against Serbia as a way of restoring some kind of general loyalty to the ruling regime. I don't regard that as a particularly legitimate reason for launching a war. The Russians, There was no territorial threat to Russia in 1914. What had happened was that the Russian ruling class had started a war against Japan in 1904, had lost in a most humiliating way, and the defeat of 1904 had been followed by a failed revolution in 1905, and the Russian ruling class thought that a war in defence of Slav brotherhood was a way of restoring national unity and general loyalty to the established order. The Germans. Again, the Germans had their own Slav minorities. The Germans were worried. The German ruling class, I shouldn't talk about nations, because although nations do exist, it's difficult to give agency to a nation. The German ruling class was worried about the economic growth of Russia, which might have been a threat to Germany by maybe 1925, 1930. Also, the German ruling class was facing severe constitutional difficulties at home. The Social Democrats had a majority in the German parliament, and this was a threat to the established Prussian ruling order, and it was believed that a short and victorious war against Russia would restore national unity. The French, France was a borderline great power in 1914. For the French ruling class, it was now or never. Go to war now against Germany, or just give up and face long-term relative national decline. For Britain, it was slightly more complex, and I think it is possible to look at individual human agency getting Britain into the First World War. We have the full cabinet records. We have a full record of cabinet discussions in London over the August bank holiday weekend. And when it was announced in cabinet that there had been all of these secret treaties made with France and all of these secret understandings with France and Russia, and that Britain had no choice in honour but to go to war in defence of Belgium and on the French side, the cabinet was split, 50-50. There was no majority. And then Winston Churchill, one of the great villains of the 20th century, in my opinion, and then Winston Churchill took David Lloyd George, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, aside in a small room and said, "Look, David, Asquith, the Prime Minister, is a drunken fool. Get us into war, and he won't last a year. And when Asquith falls, you will be the Prime Minister." And Lloyd George thought about it and went back into the cabinet room and said, "I feel so desperately for the terrible things that are being done to the Belgian people. I believe that we should go to war." And so we went to war, or rather the British ruling class took Britain into the First World War. There was no legitimacy on any side. Nobody had clear objectives for that war. And so, of course, nobody had any idea how to win it. And so the thing dragged on for 4.5 years. It killed 10 million fighting men and maybe another 10, 15 million civilians. It brought about the total collapse of any kind of civilized order in Russia. It brought about the collapse of the Habsburg Empire. It brought about the dissolution of the Prussian state in Germany. It led to the enormous expansion of the British and American states. It was a catastrophe. Now, I do appreciate that I'm speaking largely to an audience of Slovaks. There may even be a few Czechs here, or a few people who feel some residual loyalty to the Czechoslovak state. And you may say, well, if you look at it from a British point of view, the First World War was indeed a catastrophe, but at least Czechoslovakia was born out of the ruins of the Great War. Well, yes, and I don't deny that the First Republic was one of those short intervals of sanity in Central European history in the 20th century. But Czechoslovakia, in common with all of the successor countries to the Habsburg Empire, was living on borrowed time. The plain fact is that it is impossible, it is impossible for Czechoslovakia, or the Czech Republic and Slovakia, to remain as sovereign, independent nation-states. It is simply not a possibility. The reason why Czechoslovakia remained a sovereign, independent nation-state between 1918 and 1938 is because, on the one hand, Russia was absorbed in a catastrophic revolution which killed, I don't know, 50 million, 20 million, I don't know, it's telephone numbers, large numbers of people that took Russia out of the international pecking order. And of course, Germany was restrained by the Paris peace treaties, and so Czechoslovakia had 20 years of existence. 20 years of existence which are to some extent creditable. I do regard the First Republic as rather a jolly time to be alive in this part of the world, but we need to bear in mind that Czechoslovakia had a 3 million strong German minority. The German minority was treated with moderate discrimination. We have to accept that. As Slovaks, you will doubtless be aware that Prague had more members in parliament than the whole of Slovakia. Slovakia itself had a very large Hungarian minority. It was in itself an unstable creation. It was not capable of defending itself against either a resurgent Germany or a resurgent Russia. And I can't say that in the long term the Czechs and Slovaks did very well out of the destruction of the Habsburg Empire. It was simply 20 years of peace and reasonable prosperity brought about because there was a power vacuum in this region. As soon as that power vacuum was filled, Czechoslovakia became a German satellite, a German protectorate. I'm never quite sure what to call the independent Slovak state, a German satellite, let's call it. It then became a Soviet satellite, and as soon as the Soviet Union collapsed, Slovakia is now a satellite of the European Union. The idea that Slovakia has any kind of sovereign independence at the moment is a joke. It is part...
Belgian satellite.
Yes, yes. That being said, I won't say that the European Union is as bad as Soviet domination or as bad as German domination. It may even be a bit better than Habsburg domination, but it's hardly an ideal state of affairs. And so I could talk about the Great War and its consequences all night, but the point is, although I do believe that war may be legitimate, the Great War does not meet any of the conditions that I've stated. The Second World War. Now here let's come back to this argument about the legitimacy of a preventive war. I do accept the legitimacy of preventive wars. It's just that I can't think of any examples where the conditions have been met. And certainly, I do not see why Britain should have why Britain should have started the Second World War. I see no legitimate cause for going to war in 1939. Let us be plain that the objectives of the German ruling class in the 1930s and 40s were absolutely illegitimate. These objectives were the creation of a giant empire in Central and Eastern Europe for German settlement and German exploitation. There can be no defence of that. At the same time, I fail to see what reason that was for the British ruling class to get involved. I do not believe that Hitler at any time presented a clear and present danger to Britain or to any British territory. I just do not believe any of the claims that Hitler wanted to conquer the world. Oh, I mean, every politician, I'm sure, wants to conquer the world. I'm sure that the Slovak government, I'm sure the ministers in the present Slovak government have somewhere at the back of their mind how nice it would be if Slovakia could establish a gigantic empire from the borders of China to the Atlantic Ocean. But it's not going to happen. And there is no point in saying, well, the Germans were talking about the total domination of Europe. Yes, ruling classes do talk about these things. The question is, are they likely to try for them? And as I said, I just do not believe that the Germans presented any clear and present danger at any time to the territorial integrity of the United Kingdom or even of the British Empire. Hitler was, so far as you can say these things, mildly pro-British. The only treaty he ever made with a foreign country and kept was the 1935 Treaty of Naval Limitation he made with Britain. It is because Germany didn't have a serious navy that Germany was not able to follow up its victories in 1940. Hitler did not want war with Britain. On numerous occasions, he tried to negotiate a settlement with Britain, and his last serious effort was in 1941. We can again talk all night why the British ruling class was so committed to fighting the Second World War all the way to the total destruction of Britain as a great power. But the point is, it was not a just war from the British point of view. If you look at the Americans, there's no possibility of saying that American involvement in the Second World War was in any sense just. Was Hitler a serious threat to the United States? I don't think so. The Japanese, a tiny country, economically backward, was able to land one single knockout blow against the Americans in Hawaii. And again, you can get sucked into these discussions, but there is no reasonable doubt that the American ruling class knew that the attack on Pearl Harbor was coming, and indeed that it was provoked and fully expected by the American authorities as a device to get into the Second World War. Now, why the Americans wanted to join, why the American ruling class wanted to join the Second World War is another matter which we could discuss all night, but it doesn't meet the basic conditions that I've stated, that there should be an attack on the national territory. It just didn't happen and wasn't likely to happen. And so the Second World War was fought to destruction, 50 million war dead. It's very difficult when you're assessing the numbers of dead in the Second World War, because a large number of these were people murdered by the Soviet ruling class. How many people did the German army murder within the territory of the Soviet Union, and how many people had been murdered by the Soviet ruling class in the late 1930s and early 1940s? Hard to say, but so far as we can tell, about 50 million dead in the Second World War. The gigantic aggrandizement of every government that emerged as a victor from that war, an enormous loss of freedom, and nothing gained for it. Nothing gained at all. Oh, all right. German forces were cleared out of Poland and Czechoslovakia. Well, yes. Yeah, lucky Poland, lucky Czechoslovakia, I say, bearing in mind what happened immediately afterwards. It is questionable to ask. You can ask, what would have happened in Germany if there had been no Second World War? How long would Hitler have lasted? How genocidal and psychopathic would the German ruling class have become without the excuse of a total war fought in Central and Eastern Europe? I don't know, but I suspect that if there had been no Second World War, many of those 50 million people who were dead by 1945 would not have been dead. I fail to see what benefit was obtained for any people, leaving aside certain special interest groups. I fail to see what general benefit was gained for anybody by fighting the Second World War. If we now come to the Cold War, that doesn't even begin to meet the criteria I've set down for a just war. I do not believe No. It has been argued that the Soviet Union in 1945 was not a normal state. The Soviet ruling class wanted to conquer the entire world to spread its communist ideology. And we know that all of the areas that were conquered by the Soviet Union in 1944 and 1945, with the exception of Austria, we know that all of those regions became communist satellite states, and Czechoslovakia is the most obvious example of this. But I don't believe it follows from this that the Soviet ruling class had any serious intention of conquering the entire world. I do not believe the Soviet ruling class was capable of moving another foot westward into Western Europe. The cost in human and material terms of fighting the Second World War had already been catastrophic for the Soviet Union as a whole. I don't believe that it would have been possible to move any further westward, not in 1945, and certainly not at any time after that. I do not believe that the Warsaw Pact states presented any serious threat to the West European states after, let's say, 1948, certainly not after the death of Stalin. I just don't believe it. I don't believe it. I won't go into this argument because I suspect that many people will want to talk about this in the question-answer session, which can't be long in coming up. Yes, I will finish in the next few minutes. I believe that the Cold War, fought by Britain and America, was largely fought for one reason, and that was the enrichment of certain special interest groups in Britain and America. It meant unlimited funding for every military project under the sun. It meant it was possible for Britain and America to remain on a permanent war footing after 1945, right the way through until 1989. At the end of the Second World War, there was none of the usual scaling back of military effort that you normally see at the end of a large war. All that happened was a 2 or 3 year period of reduced military spending, followed by an enormous increase. British Aerospace, McDonnell Douglas, Boeing, all of the big companies that formed part of the military-industrial complex did very nicely indeed out of the Cold War, and that is why it was kept going year after year after year. It also gave politicians in Britain and America a mission, an excuse for spending large amounts of people's money, an excuse for starting wars in places like Vietnam, wars in Egypt, wars in Africa, wars all over the world, as a means of fighting this crusade against international communism. And it is no coincidence that as soon as the Soviet Union, despite the best efforts of the Western governments to prop it up, because there are enormous transfers of wealth and general materials from the Western countries to the Soviet Union from the 1960s onwards, despite the very best efforts of Western ruling classes to keep the Soviet Union alive as a means of justifying the Cold War, the wicked Soviets collapsed in 1989, which meant suddenly no excuse for these large military establishments, no excuse for these huge bureaucracies, NATO, the Ministry of Defence, the Pentagon, and all of the others. No excuse for the military-industrial complex. And so ever since 1989, the strategy of the British and American government has been to build up China into the next big threat. And in the meantime, because the Chinese just will not be provoked into behaving like Hitler and Stalin, in the meantime, to announce that Islamofascism is a threat which must be beaten back if we are to continue enjoying the freedoms that we have so far possessed. And so, to conclude, I do not say that war is in itself illegitimate. I just cannot see any legitimacy in any of the big wars that have been fought in the last 100 years. And the only thing that I can say further than that is that every time a ruling class comes forward with its corrupt media and says, here is a clear and present danger to our liberties, our duty as libertarians, no, our duty as decent human beings, is to regard everything said to us as a lie, and to insist that the ruling class should justify itself properly. It should publish the full information. It should tell us what is the nature of this threat, what is the strategy for dealing with this threat, what are the objectives, how shall we know when the war is won or lost, and if, as in the case of as in the case of my government's current involvement in Libya, those answers are not forthcoming, we should simply denounce the war as illegitimate, and we should denounce our ruling class as a pack of murderous thugs who deserve whatever may be coming to them. And so, as I said, I do not say that war is in itself illegitimate. I just have enormous difficulty finding wars that are actually legitimate. So thank you for having listened to this with such good grace, and I do hope that there is a lively set of questions to follow. Oh, and, sorry, before we move to the questions, can I have a slight word from our sponsor? My dear friend Richard Blake is currently in Slovakia promoting his various books. Conspiracies of Rome, translation to Slovak as Sprisahanie v Ríme. Terror of Constantinople, translated into Slovak as Terror of Constantinople, published to great acclaim last week by Slovak. The Blood of Alexandria, which will be published in November in Slovak by Slovak. Sword of Damascus, which will be published, I think, next year or the year after by Slovak. All books which have a very strong libertarian emphasis and which it would please my friend Richard Blake no end if you were to go out and buy copies of. And then there is my own humble offering, the Churchill Memorandum, which largely came out of the talk I gave last year about the need for a libertarian presence in the creative arts. This is a libertarian stroke conservative alternative history thriller set in a world where the Second World War didn't happen. This may be translated into Slovak, I don't know, but copies are available on Amazon. There is a Kindle edition, and for those of you who cannot wait to get home and call up Amazon, I do have one or two copies here which I'd be happy to dispose of. Sorry, that's the advertisement over.
I'd like to start with a question and related to Czechoslovakia, especially the 68 invasion, 1968, of the worst factories in Czechoslovakia.
Yeah.
You can prepare. This could be considered as a breaking the international treaties, several international treaties. So would you consider some kind of intervention of British, French, or American troops to save Czechoslovakia from direct Soviet Union management as a legitimate or no way?
I thought somebody asked that question. Let me answer it not as a libertarian, because I don't think there is a straight libertarian answer. Let me answer that as a foreign policy realist. As I said earlier, I do not believe that the Soviet Union had any intention of conquering Western Europe. I do know, however, that the Soviet, let's say the Russian ruling class, wanted a series of buffer states around it to protect its own territory from future invasion by a Western aggressor. That is why the Soviets marched into Czechoslovakia in 1945 and did not march out again. They did it partly because they wanted to give you the blessings of scientific socialism, but they did it also because they wanted any future invasion of Soviet territory to be fought in Czechoslovakia, Poland and East Germany, and not in the Ukraine, Belarus and Russia. That was an entirely rational objective, and it was stupid of Dubček to imagine that the Soviet ruling class would change its mind. The Soviet ruling class was remarkably flexible in what it would allow of its satellite territories in their domestic arrangements. The Hungarians were allowed to give up on pure socialism, and they were allowed to have something like a mixed economy. The Yugoslavs were allowed to do the same. The Romanians were allowed to have an independent foreign policy so long as it was not practically anti-Soviet. The one thing that the Soviets would not allow was democratic elections in one of their satellite states. Dubček was a fool if he thought that he could bring about socialism with a human face in Czechoslovakia. If there had been free and fair elections in Czechoslovakia in 1968 or 1969, the communists would have lost. There is no doubt of that. The communists would have lost. There would then have been a Christian Democrat, Social Democrat, I don't know what coalition would have come about, but it would not have been communist, it would not have been pro-Soviet, and Czechoslovakia would have moved, not all at once, but over 3 or 4 years, into the Western orbit, and the frontiers of the Cold War would no longer have run in a straight line from the Baltic down to the Adriatic. It would have run with a great big notch going right the way up to the border of Ukraine. And the Soviets would not allow that. They could not allow it. I have read the memoirs of Jiří Mlynář, who was a participant in the Prague Spring. I've also read the memoirs of Dubček, which are not at all reliable. I don't regard Dubček as a very reliable source. I think Mlynář is much more reliable. And according to Mlynář, when the entire Czechoslovak government was lifted out of Prague and taken off and dumped in Moscow, there was a face-to-face discussion between the Czechoslovak government and the Soviet government. And Dubček shouted, "You can't do this to us, the Americans will not allow it." And Brezhnev had a telephone brought into the room, and he picked it up and said, "I'm just going to telephone Mr. Johnson in Washington, the American president. Hello, Mr. Johnson, it's Mr. Brezhnev here. What do you think about our invasion of Czechoslovakia?" And apparently Lyndon Johnson said, "We regard this as a matter taking place within the Soviet sphere of influence, and we do not see it as our business to intervene." Now, Mlynář may be lying because this is a most dramatic incident. Brezhnev may have been lying when he had the telephone brought in. It may have been no one at all. But the point is, if this had taken place, and if Lyndon Johnson had been asked, "What do you think about this?" his private answer, leave aside whatever he said to the television cameras, his private answer would have been exactly that. This is a Soviet matter. We are not getting involved. And so when Dubček, and not just Dubček, when the Czechoslovak ruling class decided in the late 1960s that it was possible to liberalise, they were living in a fool's paradise. They could have allowed private enterprise in Czechoslovakia. as the Hungarians did. They could have run an independent foreign policy so long as it was not pro-Western. But allowing free and fair democratic elections, no. Sorry, but these people were stupid. And because of that, Czechoslovakia was invaded by all its neighbours, and you then had the normalisation, deep socialism, and everything that happened after that. My mother-in-law has an interesting story about how she went out for milk. It was back in August 1968. She went out to buy some milk and found herself looking into the gun barrel of a Soviet tank. That was brought about by Dubček. Sorry, that's not a very attractive answer, but I'm afraid that is a realistic answer.
Have you identified sometimes, like history, if there was space where legitimate worked and it didn't happen?
Good question, and because I haven't given any thought to it, I can't give you an answer to it. On the whole, I can't think of any really awful things that have happened because a war didn't take place. In most places, when a war has been avoided, it has been a blessing for humanity. It was a great blessing for humanity when in 1962 there was no war between the United States and the Soviet Union over Cuba. I can't think of any I can't think of any examples. There may be examples, but I can't think of any examples where the world has been made a worse place because of peace.
Rwanda or some...
Rwanda as well. What about what?
Rwanda, 94.
Yeah. Now there you have... okay. I suppose the argument is that if France, Britain and America had invaded Rwanda in 1994, I think it was, then the genocide would not have taken place. That may have been the case, but if you look at the actual events of those interventions which have been made, they're not terribly inspiring. At the moment, the British and French governments are fighting war in Libya to prevent a massacre, and it doesn't seem to have prevented anything. I don't believe that foreign intervention... In principle, you can say, yes, a nice, clean, 19th century style intervention would have stopped the killings. But what then? What then? Do you propose to keep Rwanda permanently as a British, French and American colony? Do you plan to hand it over to some kind of United Nations administration? Or do you simply plan to stop the killing, withdraw and wait for the killing to start again? The ability of even the great powers to have any serious impact on the ground in third world countries is very limited. I don't believe that intervention in Rwanda in 1994 would have been effective. Just as I don't believe, though I could say much else about this, I don't believe that Western involvement in the Balkans in the late 1990s brought about any good consequences. You also need to bear in mind that the Western powers are not clean platonic abstracts. These are clusters of special interests which may not always benefit from the right thing being done on the ground. I mean, can anyone say that... Sorry, Mike, let me just... Can anyone say that the Balkans have been made a better place because of the war against Serbia in 1999? I can't. Look, sorry, Mike.
I was just going to ask, how would you frame the war of American colonial disobedience in this context?
Well, you could call it the slaveholders' rebellion. I did give a speech about the American War of Independence at Bodrum last month. The Hans-Hermann Hopper conference in Bodrum last month, and I spent a whole half hour explaining that the Americans were demanding things that were unreasonable. And, well, they won the war, they got what they wanted, and ever since then they've been getting it good and hard. Sorry. What some of the American colonists wanted was independence from Britain. They got it. They got their federal government, and ever since then the Americans have been living in peace and prosperity and harmony under a government of men, under a government of laws, not of men. The American Constitution is a shining beacon to all humanity of justice and humanity.
They did fairly well indeed for a certain time. My question would be, because somebody mentioned already international law, how important is it? Is there any legitimacy to it? And I would like to have that explained, giving the example of the first IRA War, because territorial integrity played a large role in that, and the enforcement of international law, and that immediately after the end of the Cold War, and it was like a blueprint for what you might call more liberal interventionists that followed in the 90s.
Okay, when you talk about international law, you need to distinguish the various kinds of international law. There are certain treaties and conventions which are entirely good. Conventions against the use of chemical weapons, conventions against the murder of prisoners of war, conventions against torturing prisoners of war, conventions against the use of terror bombing. These are entirely good. But you see, a lot of what is called international law is nothing about humanising war and other interactions between states. Part of international law is that the Slovak Republic should not legalise cannabis. If the Slovak government were to legalise cannabis and cocaine, it would be in breach of international law. If the Slovak government were to allow unlimited transactions in cash, it would be in breach of international law. For the most part, what is called international law is a set of treaties and conventions and bureaucracies which impose absolutely unaccountable global and very largely illegitimate kinds of control over the entire world. Now, again, as far as I can tell, the first Iraq War may have been in accordance with international law as stated, or it may not have been. The second Iraq War may have been in accord with international law, it may have been against international law. The intervention in Serbia in 1999 may have been justified by international law or may have been illegitimate under international law. And when you have a situation in which you don't actually know if something is right or wrong, then to call it international law and to give it any kind of respect is, I think, mistaken. But to come back to it, the great majority, maybe 95% of what passes for international law nowadays has nothing to do with humanising interactions between states. It is simply a means by which a global political and plutocratic elite are able to exercise unlimited and unaccountable power. And as such, I suggest that we should denounce it as illegitimate from the start.
I have a question. Let's imagine Hungarian ruling class attacks Slovakia. Slovak ruling class decides to fight back. Am I obliged to fight this war even though you would regard it as just or legitimate?
The answer to that depends on so many special circumstances that I don't know where to begin. But let us imagine that the Hungarian government, which as we all know is sometimes a little strange in what it says and does, let us imagine that the Hungarian government were to announce Slovakia doesn't really exist, it's really Upper Hungary, and it were to invade Slovakia and what then should you, as a Slovak citizen, do? Well, I suppose you should fight back. But unless you're Hungarian.
What if they just want to take over Štúrov or Komárno, South Slovak cities, which I don't care about?
Which are full of Hungarians anyway.
Yes. No, I don't care to whom they pay taxes. Like, I don't really mind. Like,
Okay.
I don't care whether if the taxes are low in Hungary, they're better off, so I would hinder their better future probably by
Well,
fighting back.
If you don't actually care about Komárno and Rimavska Sobota and so on, then obviously you should not lift a finger in defence.
The question is whether I'm obliged to. Like, okay, I can decide, but
I can't give you an answer to that, it's up to you. I can tell you what I would do. If a foreign enemy, let's call it the United States of America, were to mount an armed invasion of the United Kingdom, I would gladly take up a rifle and shoot back at these people. But that's my decision. Many other people might decide otherwise. In fact, I rather think my wife would take the rifle away from me and hide it. And in England, it would be a very hypothetical case because I'm not allowed to have a rifle anyway.
more specified, my question was whether you regard it as a duty for somebody to fight a legitimate or
I do think that
Or you can.
Duty must be voluntary. If you don't believe that you have a duty to defend the Slovak state against a Hungarian invasion, then it is of course your decision, and that must be respected. And what I might say is that you can imagine a situation, not a very likely situation, in which a deeply tyrannical Slovak state were to get itself into a war with a very liberal Hungarian state, in which case, as a libertarian, you might feel inclined to support a Hungarian intervention. I must say that as an English nationalist, I do believe in loyalty to a legitimate English state. Sadly, we don't have a legitimate English state at the moment, but if we did have one, I would regard it as a duty. But as a libertarian, duty to a state must be something that you choose for yourself. And I wouldn't like to say that you did have a duty to fight for the Slovak state against a Hungarian invasion. It would be a matter for you to decide. If you can change the question around slightly, I would be entirely against conscription. I don't think that young men should be dragged into the army, have uniforms put on their backs, and be taught against their will to march up and down firing bullets. If a country is worth defending, it will be defended. Conscription, in a country that is worth defending, conscription will be useless. In a country that is not worth defending, conscription will be an evil. But again, I don't have an easy answer to that, I'm sorry.
What do you think about the legitimacy if we would actually be successful and, for example, form some big group of libertarian people, and we would find many friends in countries like North Korea, for example, which want to fight against this ruling class? Is it legitimate for us to come and attack the ruling class?
Right, okay. Let's unpack. Let's unpack that. We and us. Let us suppose that many people in North Korea want to be free. And let us suppose that Slovakia were a rich and powerful country. It is one thing for you as an individual to say, I will personally take up arms in defence of the freedom of the North Korean people. That would be your decision, and it would be a most creditable decision to make. But if you were a member of the Slovak government, you would have no right to do that whatsoever. It is not your right to use the lives and property of your fellow citizens to take part in your crusade. There is no credible threat that North Korea can make to Slovakia. There is no danger to the life, liberty and property of the Slovak people presented by the government of North Korea. And so your right as a member of the Slovak government will be absolutely zero. But your decision as a Slovak individual to take up arms in defence of right, truth and justice would be highly creditable. Equally, many people keep insisting that Tony Blair was a brave and benevolent leader because he used British armed power to liberate the Iraqi people from a wicked tyrant. Well, of course, Tony Blair did no such thing. Tony Blair did not take up arms in defence of the Iraqi people. You may have noticed that he didn't even encourage his son to join the armed forces to go and fight for the welfare and freedom of the Iraqi people. Tony Blair simply sat in his office in Downing Street and gave orders that involved the deaths of tens of thousands of people in Britain and mostly in Iraq. Your duty as a ruler of a country is to act in the general reasonable interest of the people you are ruling. It is not to start crusades all over the world to spread what you consider to be the good life.
Us as a private group, I mean.
Oh, well, yes.
It's legitimate.
Yes, of course.
But shouldn't these 5 conditions apply to individual decision for war? These 5 conditions for legitimate war?
No.
Is that the way foreseeable end of the war?
No, because if you decide to go to war with North Korea, the worst thing that can happen is that you'll get killed and perhaps a few North Koreans will get killed, which is a bad thing, but it's not quite the same as when 2 states go to war with each other and the killing may be unlimited.
Well, but, I mean, what can be used as justifying thing that if I kill any of the members of North Korean Communist Party who stands against me, I mean, what can I say that that my attack on him is justified?
Okay, difficult question. And instead of answering it, let me give you another example with which you all may be familiar. Many years ago, a group of Czechs were trying to escape from communist Czechoslovakia. They were trying to defect. And in order to get out of the country, they killed some border guards. Are these people murderers, or were they simply trying to secure their freedom? I remember watching an interesting debate on one of the Czech television channels many years ago, and I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. If you go and start killing members of the North Korean Communist Party, are you a murderer, or are you trying to promote the liberty of the North Korean people? I suppose it depends on how you do it.
Well,
Let's.
The goal of the group of brothers Machine was to escape.
Yes.
But you are not entering North Korea to escape. I see a big difference between them.
Let's go back to your original question. It depends on how you conduct your personal war with the ruling class of North Korea. If you decide to let off bombs on whatever passes for the public transport system in Pyongyang and kill 20 or 30 North Korean people as they hurry off to their factories, then you are a murderer. And it doesn't matter whether you say that you are a libertarian trying to spread liberty, you are a murderer. If, on the other hand, you try to kill Kim Jong-il, assuming he is still alive, if you try to kill the leader of North Korea, then you do have a case for arguing that you're a freedom fighter. Now that is what distinguishes terrorism from armed struggle, from freedom fighting. Many people many people in the United States and in Southern Ireland, and I'm afraid in Britain, keep on insisting that the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, in the 1970s and 80s, was fighting a freedom struggle. Well, throwing bombs into pubs in places like Woolwich and Birmingham and Guildford, and getting hold of Northern Irish school teachers and putting an electric drill through their elbows and knees, and letting off bombs in John Lewis and Oxford Street does not, to me, sound like a legitimate way of bringing about a British withdrawal from Northern Ireland. That strikes me as terrorism. On the other hand, putting a bomb in the hotel where Margaret Thatcher and many other members of the British ruling class are staying, although it's not something that I approved of, because I was at the time a strong supporter of Margaret Thatcher, and I've always been rather anti-Irish anyway, I don't necessarily regard that in principle as terrorism. Armed struggle which targets leading members of an oppressive ruling class, so long as that ruling class is unusually oppressive, should not be classified as terrorism. But most of what counts as armed struggle is terrorism. When Hamas, or whoever it is, lets off a bomb in Starbucks in Jerusalem and kills 20 office workers, I'm sorry, it doesn't matter what you think about the legitimacy of the Jewish state. That is terrorism. If, on the other hand, you decide to kill Mr. Netanyahu, that may be a very wicked thing to do, especially if you're a Zionist, but it's not terrorism. That may well be classed as armed struggle. If I say it's not terrorism, it perhaps isn't terrorism. So I'm aware of the fact that this is being recorded and will go on the internet. No, what I'm trying to do is to give you an honest answer.
Which brings us back to the killing of the Archduke.
Well, okay.
Terrorism or not?
Yes, it was terrorism. What was it supposed to bring about? You kill the Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife. Does that mean the collapse of Habsburg rule in Bosnia-Herzegovina? Does it mean that these will then join with Serbia in an everlasting brotherhood of Slavs? No, of course it doesn't. It had no... Even if there had been no ultimatum and no general war, this would have done nothing to bring about Habsburg disengagement from the Balkans. This was terrorism, pure and simple, because there was no likely good consequence. But let me go back to the attempted murder of Margaret Thatcher in 1984. As I said, I am an English nationalist. I strongly believed that the death penalty should have been used against members of the IRA who were caught planting bombs, and I deplore the surrender of the Blair government to IRA terrorism in 1998. I do, as an English nationalist, believe that we should have fought the war against the IRA to the point of victory. However, not speaking as an English nationalist, the attempted assassination of Margaret Thatcher in the Grand Hotel in Brighton in 1984 should not perhaps be regarded as terrorism in the same way as virtually every other act of the IRA was. This was an attempt to take out the leader of the government that was resisting your demands. Even the failed attempt to kill Margaret Thatcher led the British government within a few months to the negotiating table. It is because the British government was nearly wiped out in Brighton in 1984 that for the first time the British government was brought to serious negotiations with the IRA, and this led to a settlement in which members of the IRA, bloodstained murderers that they are now in government positions in Northern Ireland. I don't like what they did. As I said, I hate and despise the IRA, and although it's not legal for me to say it, if somebody were to kill Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness and all the other members of Sinn Féin IRA, I would feel sorry for the people who had to come along and clean the mess up afterwards. But I don't think the attempt to kill Margaret Thatcher in 1984 should be classed as terrorism in quite the same way as virtually every other action of the IRA was. And so if you have a liberation struggle, as long as it is a liberation struggle, and the IRA struggle was not to do with liberation, what the IRA wanted was to turn North and South Ireland into a Marxist tyranny. But as long as you have a legitimate struggle, then any armed attack on seriously important members of the ruling class may well be legitimate. It's just that most actions by national liberation or liberation groups do simply count as terrorism. As I said, whatever you think of the legitimacy of the Jewish state, letting off bombs in buses and branches of Starbucks in Israel or the West Bank is terrorism.
Given what you just said, who can we kill?
Well,
and when can we get started?
Well, the problem is that under British law, I'm not allowed to publish my list of people who should be killed. And probably under Slovak law as well.
May I?
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt you. I have two brief comments and maybe one question. The first comment is about war.
Mm-hmm.
Simply saying, it seems to be that all wars, previous wars, had the same reason. Those who were defeated in the previous war were trying to regain lost territory, very simply saying. And the second question is about, or comment is about democracy.
Mm-hmm.
19th century American philosopher Fisher Ames made very interesting comparison between democratic and a non-democratic government. According to his explanation, monarchy is like a splendid ship which is sailing until it hits the rock and sunk forever. And democracy is like a raft which never sank, but your feet are always in the water. But it seems to me that democracy is floundering, not only in the United States, but I'm sure that in Slovakia it's the case. And it means that the concept of the European Union was based on that precondition that if there will be no borders, it means that there will be no reason for war, because borders are very harmful scars on the body of Europe. The question is if democracy is floundering, and it means that politicians are irresponsible persons, who will be able to stop declaration of war, but those parties which in the previous war was on the side of defeated nations.
Okay, that's not a question so much as a series of philosophical points, so difficult to answer, but I think what I would say is that the 19th century view, which indeed finds its best expression in the Paris peace treaties at the end of the Great War, the 19th century liberal view is that once you have democratic nation states, there will be no reason for war. Why should a sovereign, free, liberal democratic Czechoslovakia go to war with Germany? Why should Germany go to war with Czechoslovakia? The problem is that we've tried this and it didn't work. And one of the reasons it didn't work is because democracy as it is currently defined is not particularly democratic. It is very difficult to argue that any of our countries is particularly democratic. In Slovakia, how often do you have elections? Every 4 years? Okay. Every 4 years you get to vote. You get to vote for lists of politicians. You have no choice over who is on those lists. And you have very real control over what they do once they get in. In Britain, we have an election every 4 or 5 years. Now, our system is slightly less undemocratic insofar as you vote for candidates, not for parties. But it still means that your choice of candidates is extremely limited. The only candidates who are likely to win elections are members of the ruling class with access to the necessary finance and media connections. And once the election is over, then that's it. Your involvement is finished for the next 4 or 5 years. And so democratic governments are not democratic. They are ruling class governments which legitimise themselves by allowing the people to vote for which group of ruling class politicians should have the jobs and the offices until the next election. And unless you do have something much more radical, I'm afraid you can't talk about democracy or a democratic peace. Indeed, even when you do have a truly radical democracy, as the Athenians had in the 5th and 4th centuries, the Athenians were a remarkably militaristic, aggressive people. When the modern historians talk about Britain declared war on Germany in September 1939, ancient historians will say the Athenians decided to declare war on Sparta. And this is not simply a linguistic convention. This does express a reality. Before the Athenian state could undertake military operations, it was necessary for a declaration of war to be debated and passed in an assembly of all the adult male citizens, even if you did that. And so it is fair to say that the Athenians did this. And the Athenians, as I said, were a remarkably aggressive people. And even if you had widened the franchise so that it wasn't just the free adult males who had been able to vote, if you allowed the women and slaves and the resident foreigners to vote as well, I don't think Athens would have been any less aggressive towards its neighbours than it was. I don't think democracies are particularly peace-loving. If you want a really peace-loving government, what you need is a rather unpopular, highly conservative ruling class, rather like the Soviet state, frightened of starting a war because it might lose, and the consequences of war are just too inconvenient. How many wars did the Soviet Union start after 1945? Afghanistan, 1979. Well, yeah. How many wars did the United States start after 1945? Yes.
Officially or unofficially?
You choose. Democracies are not terribly peaceful. Yes, Matt.
I just wanted to ask the gentleman who asked the last question. I believe he said that democracy is floundering in many places, but perhaps not in America?
Not only in America.
Not only in America, okay.
Okay, I think that we are running out of time, so let me thank Sean for his kind presentation and express the hope that we will meet again next summer. My brother went for some wine, so it would be nice if you join us to have a glass of wine. So thank you again.
And thank you to the audience, very civilised. And very tolerant as well, I might say. Thank you.